Okay, welcome. My name is Christina. I'm with Atlantic Institute, and I don't know if I've met a lot of you or yet at some events. Yeah, I think you guys look like you might be some new people that are joining us for a Zoom event. One thing I want to do is I want to share my screen, and I want to let me know if you see what I'm putting up here, because I've had a little bit of an issue sometimes sharing this. And so I'm trying to share what we have up here. And do you see that? Do you see like the website, the webpage? Okay. All right, so first we have is the About Us. So just so you know a little bit about Atlantic Institute, is we are a nonprofit organization. We are all throughout South Carolina, and we have a vision of living in a peaceful world where nonviolence, respect, understanding, friendship, cooperation, and love prevail. And our mission is to seek and create opportunities for dialogue between individuals and communities, contributing to the local and global peace by promoting values such as respect, acceptance, dialogue, love, richness of faith, and culture over centuries of time. We approach the world with realistic optimism to build a better future for tomorrow. And we believe that small positive actions can make significant changes in our lives and throughout the world. So we look to offer solutions through dialogue and education, as well as cultural activities and humanitarian works. So I just want to touch on that. We have seen recently with everything that's been going on in the news that we are going to have a greater need to have dialogue conversations regarding race. And so we figured one of the best ways to do that would be to do some book readings, to get some education from a third-party perspective, and to be able to sit and read something and have it digest in our minds and have us think about it. We have two awesome facilitators tonight. We have Johanna Myers and we have Paul Thompson. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then they can go ahead and facilitate the dialogue discussion that we're going to have. So Johanna, if you'd like to go ahead and go first, you can.
Sure. Thanks for organizing this, Christina. My name is Johanna Myers, and I'm on staff at Aldersgate United Methodist Church. I work with all ages there. I have a psychology degree from Furman, and Master of Divinity from Duke, and then have recently completed my Doctor of Ministry through Wesley Theological Seminary. And so this is, I don't know how, I've been working with the Atlantic Institute, I guess, for a few years now. I always seem to get voluntold by Christina somehow, some way. And so anyway, I'm looking forward to facilitating with Paul tonight. Paul and I have just gotten to know each other through this conversation. So this is a wonderful example of how these kinds of things can bring community, create community, which is really exciting. So Paul?
Right, thank you. Yes, and again, thank you, Christina, for organizing this, and Keith, who's on the call also. For those of you who don't know, he's the president of the Atlantic Institute. Yeah, so I'm from the New York City suburbs. I taught high school there for 13 years, and I am just starting my 16th year as a history professor in South Carolina. For the last 14 years, I've been at North Greenville University. I did my undergrad work at Oral Roberts University and got my master's in New Jersey at Montclair State and my PhD in American history from Emory. I've published not a whole lot, but a few things addressing usually race or Christianity, prohibition and temperance in U.S. history. I'm recently former associate pastor in Easley, and since 2015 I have been dean at North Greenville University. Most recently I've become dean of humanities and sciences. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me. I'm really excited about this talk tonight. We have almost an impossible task ahead of us, quite honestly. There's a lot in this book, and there's 10 of us on this call and There's only, what, 243 pages for 10 people to discuss. So first of all, this is not a lecture. This is not an opportunity for Johanna and I to tell everybody like how the world works. This is an opportunity for people to talk. Now, we're assuming that probably some people in this call have read the book completely, some have read it partially, and some have not read it at all. There's probably a mixture, and so that's fine. Yes, feel free to use the chat feature. Do feel free to use that. So what we want to do is roughly divide tonight into 3 roughly equal segments. It's already 10 after 7, so I can't say 3 20-minute sections, but we'll do the best we can. But we want you to talk. We want the conversation. We want dialogue. So here's the thing. In my study, in my reading on race and my living race, I've come to the conclusion that it's fairly reasonable to say that there are 2 kinds of Americans on this topic. There are Americans who have, I'm going to use a strong word here, but there are Americans who've been traumatized by race. Now, all trauma is not of equal intensity or equal duration, but one can almost speak of a spectrum of trauma. There are those that have been traumatized by it, and so as she points out in her book, they live it every day. They can't like get up and not think about it. And then there are individuals in America who seem to get up and go through life and don't hardly ever give it any thought. And so there are these 2 groups. Quite honestly, her book is primarily targeted towards those in that latter category who just, it's not a traumatic daily reality or a painful reality or something they give a lot of thought to. So with that in mind, the way we want to break up the remainder of our time tonight is in 3 segments. The first segment, I want to focus a little bit more on, we want to focus primarily on those, if you will, for whom race is a painful experience, lived experience in America. And then Joanna will shift and take the next section where we talk more about the other group in terms of the reaction and who this book is targeted towards largely. And then we'd like to end this discussion tonight with sort of a now what, or then what, or what do we do? And how do we move forward? So when Joanna and I got together to discuss how we were going to structure this, we asked ourselves, each other, the question like, what really stood out to you in this book? What would you have to talk about if we're going to talk about 1 or 2 things tonight? And so we actually both had on the top of our list the same thing. So I'm going to start there, and that is her definition of racism. So I don't know if you have the book in front of you. It's chapter 2, page 23. And on the bottom of page 26, she identifies 2 definitions of racism. I was really, really excited about this chapter because I find in my experience when talking to people, most often people talk past each other because they actually have different functioning definitions of racism. So they're really not talking about the same thing when they talk to each other a lot of times. And so on the bottom of 26, she says racism, one option A is that racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race, or 2, the definition of racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those views are reinforced by systems of power. So those are her 2 definitions. Her point is that the second definition is the one she's working from in this book. And her point is that if you're primarily concerned about the first definition, this book may not help you a whole lot except for to maybe convince you to use the second definition. The way I describe, that distinction is important to me. I often describe that second definition as the academic definition. Scholars of race, 9 out of 10 times are referring to a system. They're not referring to individual prejudices. Many people on the street, you just meet them in your church, your organization, your neighborhood. If they talk about race, they're usually thinking of somebody who dislikes somebody because of who they are. Academics are usually talking about systems. They're talking about structures that have created the racial inequalities we see in America today, whether they be economic and financial, whether they be health inequities, whether they be housing inequities, employment inequities. You can go down the list. The amount of studies is endless that show that people of different races live very different, have very different lived realities in America. So there's a lot that can be said there. I'm going to stop right there because I've already talked enough, I think, for this point right here, and just sort of throw it open. I'm curious if anyone would like to jump in on what chapter 2, what stood out to you in chapter 2. Obviously, we can't go through the whole book, so we're just going to pick a couple of items. You know, I don't know, does anybody want to share any thoughts on her definition of racism, sort of how that resonated with you or did not resonate? You can just unmute yourself, I believe, and feel free to share.
Yeah, I was going to say you should be able to unmute, and sometimes if there's a lot of us that want to say something, you can raise your hand on there so we can see who wanted to speak first.
Yeah, I don't, right.
There is a raise hand spot.
Paul, while everybody's kind of working towards figuring out what they want to say, because I know everybody's thinking about what they want to throw out there. I noticed, like, as we were talking, one of the things about this definition is that we talked about as how important it was to have this definition that was more system and corporate, kind of in its focus, is that it affects the way that we approach combating racism in our society.
Yes.
And so, like, her definition becomes incredibly important. Like what you were saying, the average person on the street has a tendency to think about it maybe in individual terms. And so then all of a sudden our approach to dealing with racism is, are you a nice person or not? Do you treat people with respect? You know, do you use, you know, bad words or make an inappropriate joke or something like that? And versus a systems approach to racism and how we understand racism, at which point the way we combat it is to look at how our systems are working. And so it's really ineffectual if we're only going to talk about racism from an individual perspective. So I don't know if that really struck anyone kind of as they're reading that it really does matter how we just start with that first definition.
This is Janet Greiner. I'm in Denver, Colorado.
Hi, Janet.
And I say that just to give you, because different regions of the country
Well, yes.
are in different places.
Yes.
So while Denver would be considered rather mild, and although we had KKK back then and still do a bit, not a lot, and I've talked to 3 different Black friends about that I was reading this book, and they're glad that I am, glad that I brought it up, pleased to express some of their feelings and impressions. And along that line, so they see me and I see myself as just a nice white woman, and we're friends, and they would say to me things like, you don't see me as Black, you see me just as a person, but I need you to see me as Black. Which brings us to the difference of these definitions.
Yeah.
See me as a person that's had to go through stuff and that has to deal with things daily that you never had to deal with. So that's been a new light for me to see and be sensitive and aware of their struggle in their lifetimes. I can say a lot more about those 3 friends, but it's probably not my turn to just keep going, so I'll stop there for now.
That's a great point, Janet. Thank you for sharing that, because I think, I don't know about any of y'all, but I've seen a lot of well-meaning people say, but I'm colorblind. And that's not gonna get us anywhere. that didn't help. Catherine, you had your hand up.
Hi, everyone. So I'm in Greenville, not in Denver, but I teach at Greenville Tech. I'm in the English department there. It's a 2-year college in Greenville, and I love it. But I read her book, Ujoma's book, a year ago. So I've just been listening to it on audio. And I've only had time to re-listen to like half of it. But it was helpful to me, especially like in a position as an educator, to hear her difference in definition, because a lot of times all of my students will get like prejudice and racism confused. So it's been helpful to me to think of it in that way and explain it to that way to my students. But I also love the point that you made, Johanna, too, about this being something that is like, that it's corporate. And so the impact of systemic racism is like, that's towards a group, and we're complicit as a group, like for white people, complicit as a group. Because then I think like in Greenville, I live in a neighborhood that I'm moving out of in several weeks, and I'm very excited. But a neighborhood that is, I mean, y'all live in Greenville, I live in North Main, in a duplex that is falling apart, let me tell you. But in Greenville, like if you say like North Main or like other neighborhoods, you know, like, okay, pretty much everyone there is white. Whereas if you say like Nicholtown, Brutontown, Poe Mill, whatever, you know, pretty much everybody there is a person of color, or at the least like is economically disadvantaged. And so that's where I think Ujoma's definition is very helpful for me to think like, yes, I can build my own empathy or my own stamina for talking about racism or confronting that myself, but that doesn't change on its own. Like my individual interactions with other people don't change on their own. The fact that my city is so incredibly divided along racial and economic lines. So anyway, so that was helpful for me to read in her book.
Thank you. I think this is so, it's so important for people to grasp this idea, but it's also so difficult once you grasp it, because then you run into the challenge of, my goodness, it's such a big system, right? Like, what can I do? So one of the things that I think is incredible about her book is that in almost every chapter, she tells you what you can do, you know, what you can do. And that is wonderful. Now, I will admit, one of the things Joanna and I also said the other day is like, you know, just like with any book, there is no such thing as a perfect book. You know, there are many areas that, you know, we might want to criticize, and all of her suggestions I'm not comfortable with, but most of them are really, really helpful, and are really good ideas. I want to just read one of them that I liked, and it's in this chapter on racism, on page 35, that first full paragraph, or the only full paragraph on that page. If you hear someone at the water cooler say black people are always late, you can definitely say, hey, that's racist. But you can also add, and it contributes to false beliefs about black workers that keeps them from even being interviewed for jobs, while white workers can be late or on time, but will always be judged individually with no risk of damaging job prospects. Okay, yeah, it's like, wow. Yeah, that's wonderful. And you know, I wish I would be that articulate in those moments. But you know, it's interesting. I actually know of a white woman who actually, in her interview, when they said, you know, what's one of your weaknesses? She said, oh, I'll be late every day, but I'll get the job done. And they hired her. You know, I don't know that I can imagine myself saying that as a black person. That's sort of mind-boggling, mind-blowing, that anybody, you know, could do that at all. But I'm not sure I would try to. Let me throw in one more thing, and then maybe we can begin to shift a little bit, because we can go back and forth.
And I think too that I think Rachel might have had her hand up. Rachel,
oh, I'm sorry.
Hand up?
Sorry.
Or were you waving? Did you have something to say?
I was
sorry.
My
I'm
hand.
so sorry. Thank you, Christine.
Oh,
she was using her real hand.
My real hand. But I appreciate your trying to move the conversation along.
No, I appreciate you contributing.
I'll confess that I only read bits and pieces of the book because I was stealing it from my husband when he wasn't reading it, and we were trying to read it fast enough to return it to Amazon within the 30 days that they allowed us to stop a refund. So I find it helpful to think about this system versus individual thing because it also impersonalizes it, because as white people especially, it's very easy to take it personally when we talk about race and think like, well, I'm not part of the problem, like I'm a nice person, you know. But when you think of it as this system, it turns everyone into sort of a victim of the system. And I mean, like you said, like white people are not traumatized by the system, so we're not victims in that way, but like we all are, we're all part of this system, and like we receive things without choosing to receive them, and we are taught to think in ways without choosing that. And so when we understand that it's this impersonal system that we are all existing in, it makes it a lot easier to be like, oh, okay, I need to take responsibility for like making myself better and doing a better job, but I don't have to feel like I'm just a failure and a terrible person because I might be racist. It's just like, okay, I might have been taught to be racist, and you know, now I have to start unlearning that, and that's okay, and let's go, you know.
And that's fascinating to hear you say that, Rachel, because I've heard people criticize this approach because of the same reason you like it. There clearly is a divide, and Americans come in different perspectives on this, but there's a divide on, shall we say, how much emphasis do we put on individual responsibility for anything, or how much either blame or credit, right, does the individual get either for achievement or failure. And Americans fall on a wide continuum on that matter. Some are very much so fixated on the individual, and others are much more concerned about trying to understand, you know, broader systemic, collective corporate sort of influences. And so, you know, on that note, I'll throw this tidbit in also. Some of you may be familiar with this term. Matter of fact, I know some of you are, because I know some of you in this call personally, but there is a phrase that academics use. There's a field of scholarship called critical race theory that's rooted in something more broadly called critical theory. And this is really, in many ways, a really great sort of lay person's primer on critical race theory. And her definitions of words, you know, like racism, intersectionality, and such, or microaggressions, all of that comes out of critical race theory, but this is not a time to talk about that. I just thought I'd throw that word out there, that phrase. One more thing I wanted to throw out is the only criticism that I think is worth bringing up in this conversation tonight, because if I had to rank criticisms, I would rank this highest, and Johanna and I were talking about this on Tuesday. It's so fascinating, of all the groups, all the people groupings that are discussed, she omits people of faith, of any faith, religion categorically. Of course, she self-identifies as an atheist. So at some level, that's, you know, it's not surprising, but it's interesting because I think religion, Johanna and I were saying the other day that we feel that it actually plays a dual role, in that for some people it can actually ameliorate some of these racial differences, because there are certainly, no religion is perfect on this, but there are certainly strands within various religions where you know, the faithful are, their priority is to highlight their faith identity over their ethnic or racial identity. There are certainly strands within all the major religions who try to do that. And so for some people it can be ameliorative, but obviously also if you are a religious minority in a culture, you know, then it could be added to these lists of people that, you know, have to deal with microaggressions and various other things. So that's just sort of one thing I'd like to just sort of point out. But Johanna, I'm going to turn it over to you, unless I'm missing another raised hand.
No, I think you got them all.
Okay.
For now.
Sure. Well, and I was, you know, kind of picking up where we've already really headed into with this idea of understanding kind of our place and how we address racism. I think I'm gonna hazard a guess that we're all on this call. Even Paul and I, just because we, in this particular season of our country's history, there's this pressing need. We maybe feel this pressing need to learn more, to act more, to kind of figure out how we fit into this. And I know for me, this shift into understanding my place in the larger system is a eye-opening one, and it's taking some internal work, which is a good thing. Rachel, I really appreciated what you said about how when we start to look at it as a system, it kind of takes out that sense of like the depersonalization, so that it's not just about me, but it's also about my place in a larger system. And that's what I really have to work on. And that's maybe what I haven't worked on. So for me, two of the chapters that I thought were particularly helpful in thinking about this, her chapter on privilege, because that's a hot topic. And she even says it's a phrase like check your privilege, that can get used as almost a weapon to shut down a conversation in its track. But when we step back and actually kind of think about what the term means, so she actually, she defines privilege, and I think we've already, our page numbers, depending on which version of the book we're using, is maybe a little bit off, but this for me is on page 58. Privilege in the social justice context is an advantage or a set of advantages that you have that others do not. These privileges are not due 100% to your efforts, although your hard work may indeed have helped. And the benefits of these privileges are disproportionately large, or at least partially undeserved when compared to what the privilege is for. It's a really helpful definition to kind of say, I don't know about y'all, but I know that I've been in conversations with other white people who are quick to point out that they've had to work hard for what they've gotten, and they don't consider themselves to be privileged or, whatnot, and they're missing the point completely of what we're trying to kind of get across when we're talking about race, right? That okay, yeah, you probably did have to work hard, but race was never part of the factor for you. As Paul said, like there are those in our country that have to deal with this every waking minute of the day. Just from literally, like Paul, what you were saying, you would never walk into a job interview and say, well, I'm going to be late every day, but I'll get my job done. Like that would, I don't know that I would ever say that either.
A lot of people wouldn't, probably.
So there's a lot of us that probably wouldn't, but boy,
right.
But at the same time, how that disproportionately could affect your ability to get a job. It never occurred to me when I walked into a bank to secure my mortgage that that race would come into play, right? That's a privilege that I have that I am 99% of the time completely unaware of, right? It takes work on my part. And so I think she does some really good work in this chapter on privilege of kind of of how we understand that. And one of the things that really struck me in this concept of privilege and her discussion of that is she says, and for me this is on a kind of middle of page 61, the concept of privilege violates everything we've been told about fairness and everything we've been told about the American dream of hard work paying off and good things happening to good people. And I just think that sentence right there just really gets at one of the big struggles that we wrestle with, is that people have identified so strongly with this idea of the American dream. If you just work hard enough, you will succeed. And that's not necessarily how it works here. And again, we've come back to this idea of racism as a larger system at play, and how important it is for us to check our privilege kind of along the way. Anybody else want to? Yeah.
I'll just add an experience into that.
Yes.
When we talk about privilege, is my family for 22 years has been a foster family. So I'm a second generation foster parent. And so I have 5 adopted siblings, and they're all variations of Puerto Rican. Right. And so, and some of them are darker, some of them are lighter. 4 of them are siblings, 1 of them is not. You know, but my sister, we got my sister when she was 15 and pregnant, was when we got one of my sisters. And I remember washing dishes with her, and you know, she was 15 and I was 20, I think. I was already, I was 20 or 21, and we would drive in the car, and we would have conversations, and we would drive in the car. She's like, "Look at all you white people out here driving cars, you know, but somebody just give me a car." And I was just like, "What do you mean, you white people?" You know, and I was like, "You white?" I said, "Anybody?" I said, "Do you see those other people of other colors that have cars?" And then I realized, from her view growing up in the projects in Tampa where she grew up at, she didn't see white people drive any cars. And so it's kind of like the lid of her leadership level. Like, I was thinking like the laws of leadership, like the lid for them in that area was a car is a white person's dream. Like, it happens for white people, it doesn't happen for black people. And I remember going, "Wow, you," and I was like, "Oh, I can't," and and so I always joke that when we got my sister when she was 15, I became white. I was like, "Oh," because everything got pointed out. Well, you white people do this, and you white people do this, and sometimes we'll just joke and we'll go, I know, it's us white people, but I really got that there were like that there were differences, and that there was like the systemic differences, and I work with teen moms, and to me, you see like a white person, a Hispanic person, a black person. No, a lot of those teen moms, they don't see that. They see that's a Haitian, that's a Dominican, that's a, and I was like, whoa, we have it now. You've got even categories.
Yeah.
It was like, I wasn't even there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really, I think so like Paul said, this book actually gives some really good, like, practical responses or kind of conversation starters, or kind of how to reframe it. And one of the things I appreciated in this chapter was how she says, like, you take the time to examine your privileges and do it ahead. Do it now when you're not in the middle of a heated conversation, or God forbid, in the middle of a social media, conversation, which is never going to work, right? Like it's just never, it's going to make everybody angry and everybody stressed. But check your privilege now, right? When you can think clearly about, I don't know, but it's not something we like to think about. And
well, and of course, there's many kinds of privilege, right? There's many kinds. But the other thing, her point about privilege is not just check it so that you quit judging others. That's sort of a negative thing, right? But one of her points was check it so that you can figure out how to use it to help others who don't have whatever the privilege is, whether it be an economic one, a racial one, a gender one, you pick your privilege. But and so the obligation to use it to help.
Like, where do we step into an advocacy role? Because we have a voice, we just haven't been using it in this particular area. Yeah, absolutely. It's not just a negative thing. It is to a certain extent a sense of there's some power associated with that, with privilege, and how we use that power matters for sure. I don't know about y'all, but there are parts of this book, particularly for me as a white Southern, somewhat naive person, that are uncomfortable. She hits some kind of maybe some sore spots at times, and I've forgotten who kind of brought this up, and I apologize for that. But this idea of there are going to be some points along the way where we have to step back from the she hurt my feelings, or this is hurting my feelings, or it's uncomfortable for me, and actually just kind of lean into the hard work. So I don't know about y'all, and again, we need to kind of wrap up so that we can talk maybe more about and let y'all talk. But the chapter on tone policing was an important one for me. But what if I hate Al Sharpton, which I got a big kick out of the chapter title. I kept looking at that chapter, wondering what it was going to be about. And then I got there and I thought, oh, ouch. This one is one maybe I need to read a couple of times. But this idea of tone policing and prioritizing the comfort of those who are in a position of privilege over and above the actual conversation and the work that needs to be done. And I just thought, gosh, this is a chapter that we need to read and chew on and listen to and chew on some more. So I don't know about y'all, but for me, those were probably two of the most important chapters in terms of kind of my own reflection. What about y'all? What are you thinking? Thoughts on privilege or tone policing, or also any of the other kind of topics?
Feel free to bring up, if there's anything else that you really are like chomping at the bit to discuss that we haven't brought up. I think it's a good time to do it.
Go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Carlos.
My name is Carlos. I'm from Orlando, Florida. I've been involved with the Atlantic Institute doing some interfaith dialogue. We have a chapter here through our church. We've been doing it, St. Margaret Mary, having Catholics and Muslims together. That was a real nice 2 classes that I took on that.
Very cool.
Anyway, the one thing that sticks out to me about white privilege, premised protesters that walked into the Capitol building, I think it was, with their weapons, and nothing happened against, where you would have
Michigan,
somebody else go in there like, black protesters or maybe Black Lives Matter, and now they're labeling Black Lives Matter as anarchist and terrorist. And so I could just imagine them going in there and then, they're sending SWAT in after these guys, compared to they just let these guys waltz in with, and actually it was a skiff. I think it was a classified room that they entered, which was against regulation, because of all the documents and everything that were there, and they got away with it. And that was just something that I thought was something that was white privilege that was beyond reproach. But there's many examples of those.
Yeah.
Around.
Good example.
Thank you for sharing that. I think you're right. I think that's certainly a big kind of slap in the face kind of example recently of how we see it playing out on a large scale, for sure. Absolutely.
And I think the reason why most people want to now really go ahead and have some meaty discussions about all this stuff is because people would make excuses, I think, for certain things that you might see in the past. But I think now what we've seen, people are just like blown out of the water.
Right.
True. Yeah, I instigated my pastor and some of the people on the social Peace and Justice Committee that we have, and we have that ministry, Peace and Justice, and they do a lot of stuff, bridging the color divide. We try to lower the gentrification in a neighborhood that's called Hannibal Square here in Winter Park. I participate also with Valencia College. They have their Peace and Justice Institute. So there's a lot of things that are going on, but it had been 2 or 3 weeks that had gone by. I didn't hear anything from the pulpit, and I was like, I wrote a letter to a couple people, and then I was like very reluctant to launch it, thinking that I would offend people, but they know my heart. They know I'm involved. I'm involved with prison ministry. So anyway, I said, why aren't we doing something? So now we have a weekly Zoom meeting where we're discussing faith and the Catholic Church and what we should be doing about racism. And we're sharing the narrative, we're sharing books, we're sharing all kind of stuff. The last thing I told them that they needed to see was uncomfortable conversations with a Black person, which was Emmanuel Aiko. If you haven't seen that, you got to see that. That's absolutely phenomenal. He's done about 4 or 5 of those. But again, the conversation has to continue, and just people, there's two: we commit a sin or we omit a sin. So a lot of us don't realize that not doing anything, you're not. My philosophy is if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So
that's good. Thank you. That's a great segue into where we need to go here at the end in terms of what can we do. What is action, and is conversation enough, or when is conversation action?
Yeah.
These kinds of things. It's we don't want just conversation, but
can we get Catherine's question?
Yeah, Catherine and Lauren, did I see a actual hand up, or was that just your pen? Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure. All right, I want to make sure. Yeah. Okay.
Just
Catherine.
super quick. So I read her book last summer, and the chapter on tone policing was really helpful for me, but also very challenging as an educator because I teach argument. And so, like the way that I have been taught argument and the way that I frame it and the way that I've been teaching it is just, if you're going to create a strong argument, you don't want to shut down your audience by allowing emotion to come into it too fast. You want to stay as objective as possible. And so that still presents a challenge to me to figure out how do I teach that well? So since I read her book, I've been telling my students, that there are occasions when anger is appropriate, and that there are things in the world that we should be mad about and we should be upset about. But I still, when it comes to them writing these arguments, that's not the place for it, the academic. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure out how in the world do I prep them for the kind of argument they're supposed to be writing while also allowing for sometimes you should get mad and it's on the rest of people for not recognizing that you're mad because something matters to you that we're not paying.
How do you argue in a white culture that doesn't want emotion in your arguments, right?
Yeah, we teach it to shut emotion down.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and of course there's degrees of emotion, but also even just, the whole philosophy, the whole sort of critical race theory approach he's taking is, it's intentional about upending some of our long held and cherished traditions. So, her argument really doesn't fit into traditional teachings, that we've been using for a few centuries or more on that. Her argument doesn't fit in. It's meant to challenge those. It's meant to make you question those traditional teachings.
I think it circles back as well, Paul, to where you even really started, and that when we talk about race, we're talking about something that has inflicted great trauma on a lot of people. And you said some more than others, maybe, and kind of depending on where we're coming from. So even as we're kind of trying to formulate an argument or a debate, I think tone policing and a lot of what we've seen maybe after the protests and some riots and whatnot, that our discomfort shouldn't be more important than than the empathy of understanding that the people that we're talking with have undergone trauma because of what we're talking about, right? That plays a factor, and that's on us to have some empathy in this case, and to do some of the emotional work, the inner kind of thinking and critical thinking kind of within ourselves, that it's important for us to recognize that this isn't just an academic debate. This is a everyday traumatic experience for a great many people. But you're right, Catherine, it's really hard because we're used to having that, take emotion out of it. Let's talk about this in a logical fashion. That logic doesn't necessarily work here.
So let me just,
Well, I would say
so,
Lauren's got her
oh,
hand
go
raised.
ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, I did raise my hand this time. I wanted to say one of the things that I really liked was her focus on the sort of intersectionality between race and class, because I feel like that gets downgraded a lot in conversations, especially when you're talking about something like the American dream and the fact that if you work hard, you'll get what you want or whatever, because when you're kind of bound by both class and race, like that makes it even harder than it would be with only one of those. And I think that it, especially when you take into fact like things like gentrification and redlining, like you can't help but notice that those two are just neck and neck, like right with one another. So I really like the fact that she brought that up, because you really can't have one without discussing the other.
Yeah, intersectionality is a really big deal that we could have spent a whole hour just discussing that alone. It's a really important concept. It's also as touchy as white privilege as a word for some people, for various theological and philosophical reasons.
Yeah.
So, but it's an important word, and it captures a thing. So one of the things, you know, that she does, that I guess that I'm not totally comfortable with, her you know, her whole last chapter, for those of you maybe you haven't got to the end, but her whole last chapter is like, you know, what can I do? But of course she has that throughout many chapters. But at the end of the day, her approach is to put all the, you know, responsibility on who she would call white people, who I would call non-traumatized, because I believe there are non-whites who are relatively untraumatized by race. You know, but for the majority, you know, she's trying to say whites this, whites this, whites this. You know, I guess, and the question is, and she addresses this variously. Many non-whites like feel exhausted trying to, quote, help white people get it. You know, that's something worth saying, or worth knowing if you're a white person,
Yeah.
that many black people are just exhausted at trying to help white people. But personally, since we're all in this nation together, we're all American citizens, I'm not comfortable with, like, you know, leaving, you know, all non-white people off the hook on how to move forward to create a better America, to work forward to, you know, undermine systemic racism. I'd like us all work together on that personally, but I think there are different approaches. Another little thing that there's another book that I like on this subject, well, several other books, but something that's helpful to think about, since we're dealing with mostly, since I guess I'm the only black person here, although I guess technically not the only person of color, maybe, but in so many ways to parse this. And here's an interesting question, though, for white people. How much do you either have non-white voices in your life, or have you ever, depending on your career or your faith tradition, have you ever submitted yourself to the mentorship of a non-white person, or the leadership of a non-white person, voluntarily? I'm not talking about getting hired where, you know, your boss happens to be black or Hispanic, but I mean, you know, where you choose to associate in a context where you don't have to choose to be there, and that person is not white. And that's a really challenging question, I think, for a lot of people. A lot of white people, if they sit down and say, you know, who are my 10 favorite authors, or who are my 10 favorite speakers, you know, who are my 10 favorite thinkers, are they all white? If they come out to all be white, that should tell you something. That should open your eyes to something right there, that maybe something is just a little, you know, could be adjusted there. And
Yeah, Paul and I, in our conversation earlier this week, obviously you probably could guess from our introductions that both of us like to dive in from an academic perspective. We've kind of racked up some degrees along the way. And so I know for me, this summer, my commitment was to listen and to learn, like to study and to step back and make sure that the people that I was reading and learning from were people of color, and to do a better job of kind of paying attention to exactly what Paul was just referencing. But one of the things that really kind of, again, she hits some kind of sore spots for me, but in that last chapter of what else can I do, she says, many people are afraid to talk about race just as many people use it, talk to hide from what they really fear, which is action. And I think that's probably true for me from an education perspective, right? Like that I'll keep educating myself until the cows come home. But what's the next, like what's the action that kind of goes with that? And so her list of small steps were really, I thought, really important. Not that everybody has to jump into kind of all of them, but finding that one kind of area that you're really just going to get kind of connected with. So I didn't know if any of y'all, and again, kind of, I understand that everybody's read the whole book and fine, you know, but are there small steps, are there kind of action plans that you've thought of in the last few weeks of, you know, what are the next steps for you? Leah. Yeah. Sorry, I might have said that wrong.
No, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I always have to think about how to balance like learning and action, because they have to happen, like both have to happen. Like I've been counseled by some women of color in my life that white folks can be really quick to be like, okay, I get it, let's move on, let's solve racism right now. And like are like really like ready to like, okay, let's fix this, and not taking the time to really actually like more deeply learn and understand the experiences of people of color. And so I would almost say like wherever, like, but I also like, am a person who tends to be like, I can also study forever and like never do anything. So like kind of finding a way to like balance both of those. Like if your inclination is just say like, okay, I get it, I've read the book, now I'm going to go fix racism. Like, okay, maybe you need to like slow down a little bit and read more, watch some more. But also like if all you're doing is reading, then like finding ways to donate. Like one of the things I did this past month was like I was like, I actually have all these like anti-racism books on my reading list, but I haven't actually bought them. I'm gonna go buy them like from a Black owned bookstore, or like make sure I'm like monetarily supporting people of color as well as like donating to places, but kind of whatever pieces of your life you can, I don't know, there's a lot of things obviously to do, but I also want to, I guess, make a point too, like learning is part of it. Like it's like learning something and doing it has to kind of go hand in hand. So
that's good.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Catherine.
I was just given a second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
This is Janet again.
Yes.
Back to my friends, but specifically to one, because of this COVID time and because he's a physical education gym kind of instructor, he had 2 jobs with 2 different facilities. He lost both of those. He hasn't had work now from either of those and won't, because they're city run, both of them, 2 different cities. And he decided, so I had been taking his classes at the city gym. He decided to open his own studio. What he was able to do was rent by the hour studio time at a gym, well, just at a studio, and kind of a aerobic studio, and call on his former students, because that's our client. So trying to turn us into clients. And I've been helping him with, I did things like, well, go to his classes 5 times a day. 5 times a week, and then I thought, okay, you can only have 8 people because of the COVID thing. So you're not going to ever make a living on that. And he was like, yeah, but I'm working as hard as I can, like it's been brought up before. I'm doing everything I can. So then I said, hey, Zoom, and he didn't really know about Zoom. So I've taught him about Zoom, and I've bought him a subscription for a year for Zoom.
Wow.
And I'm doing his Zoom
Wow.
mastering and setting his Zoom clients up and giving them their emails. And I'm doing all this for him. And yet he says, but you're just doing these things for one person. That's, while it helps him, he gets that and he's thankful, but it's just, he's saying to me that's too little. And I get that, but then I say, well, yeah, but I'm one person and that's about what I can do is one person. But this conversation and his conversation is saying to me, well, I did say to him, why didn't you invite me to any of the protests downtown Denver? Well, I didn't think I could. Well, I said, next time you better invite me. If I'm supposed to be doing more, I need to be educated on what more I can do. I said, look, I've given as much money as I can right back in March, just as the whole COVID thing. I made donations to 3 food banks. I told him, I said, well, that's probably the bigger thing that I can do that you would never know. I just need you to know I did a rather big thing that, so it's, and I said, so many of my friends and the kind of people, white people that are upper middle class are doing is these kind of donations that you don't know about, but you're a recipient of. And so we're kind of going back and forth in this conversation. I think the most important thing is learning how traumatized he is for all the past. And then I don't know if all Black people do this, maybe you can speak to us of this, Paul, or Carlos, maybe from your perspective, Hispanic, the entire history will start a conversation and so for 300 years, you've oppressed me. It's like, yeah, but I get that. And there's progress that's happened. And can we please talk about sort of the present and what we can do now? Because if you're carrying this whole 300 years into the whole conversation, I can't ever undo that. I can only try to undo and learn what's going on. And maybe only in my city can I do it. So maybe you can help me with how do we go with this? What's the action?
Well, I appreciate your attitude. Let me just jump in, Janet. I appreciate your attitude. There's not a thing wrong with your attitude. I think that one of the many challenges involved in this conversation is the pain. Of course, we know that if you take 2 individuals that are traumatized as children in a similar way, it doesn't mean that their responses as they grow up and get into adulthood are going to be the same, right? They have the same trauma, but not the same coping mechanisms that they turn to. Yeah, it's easy, unfortunately, it can be very easy for some people to get into, for some non-whites to just grow very bitter and very angry. I'm sorry that he throws up 300 years of oppression because, you know, it's not helpful on, like, you know, what are we going to do today? You know, I do think, you know, again, just for education, you know, Catherine, our professor here, along with me, I mean, quite honestly, I think much of like what he's referencing, I find that usually once white people know what Black people know about the past, they're like, oh, wow, well, that's a little different. You know, like, well, that's different now that I know that. It's just a lot of the stuff white people just don't know for various reasons. And so just the knowledge alone can alter how you filter contemporary things, current events. No, one person can only do so much. And here's the thing, if he becomes successful in business, potentially he will have two options, right? He will gain some small amount of wealth that he can perhaps pass on to somebody, perhaps his own children or grandchildren. But aside from that, if he gets successful in business, he can educate another non-white, another family member, friend, cousin, neighbor, about how to be successful in business. So you have planted a seed that he has to water and nurture himself. So I don't think you're doing anything wrong. You're doing everything right.
And I think, Janet, you raised a really interesting point about how, and Leah, you touched on this as well, like the balance between education and action. I think, Janet, you've also kind of touched on that balance between what do we do from a one-on-one perspective, with how we interact with other people who may be different from us, but also how do we interact from a local community perspective, and then also how do we interact with our national community. So, and even within those kind of small steps that we get in the book, there are things from like they're big things, right? From boycotting kind of large businesses or something like that. But then there are also things like how do we vote? How do we pay attention to who we vote for from a local perspective, or how do we get involved? Like Janet, what you're saying, from how do we support local organizations and with our money or whatever. So there's that balance, right, between the interpersonal and then the larger kind of community, and kind of back it out. And that
it's good. Yeah.
I think those are all important. Like I knew even just the vote local thing for me was really critical. Just that idea that I put a whole lot more energy into kind of national politics than sometimes I do in terms of, I'm not from Greenville, I'm from the lower part of the state. And even though I've lived here for more than 10 years, sometimes I feel out of the loop in terms of local politics, but recognizing just how important paying attention to local politics actually matters for my community. So that balance between the big picture and the very kind of central community picture,
that's good.
I think is really important as well, because Janet, you said it, we can't do everything. One person can't do everything, but we can kind of figure out where we fit into this. Lauren's got her hand up.
I was just gonna say, with what Janet was saying, I feel like that's a really good example of what Paul mentioned at the beginning, which is that a lot of times two people will come into a conversation with different definitions of a word. So I feel like you're focusing on the first definition of racism, which is more like individual. You're like trying to be better to the people around you. And he's like, well, the system still sucks. So what are you going to do about that? And that's definitely not fair to you. Personally, I think you're doing a great job.
Well, I think I didn't need a congratulations. I'm just doing it. But I think
nation is good though.
Nationally, the biggest issue I can think of that I can maybe do something for is I think we have to have a mail-in vote in every county and every state in this nation. This is ridiculous that some people are excluded from being able to just have their paper ballot and think carefully about it and research and vote and put it in the mail box. Or in our city, we have these special drop boxes. You can mail it or take it to the county house or take it to these special boxes. And I want a movement about that, getting the vote for every county and every city across the nation.
Yeah, unfortunately, everybody doesn't want more people to vote.
I know.
But what a great example, Janet, of a larger, like you're working one-on-one with somebody, but then also involved in kind of a larger community aspect. And I think that's a great example of how kind of the both and finding an area that you're really passionate about. If it's voter rights, go for it. If it's education, go for it. I mean, we haven't even, I mean, we haven't even remotely gotten to her chapter on prison, school to prison pipeline and affirmative action and all that kind of stuff, which is,
I was gonna add.
Yeah.
I was gonna add, like, until you delve into it or until something like personally affects you, do you really fully understand it? Because like one of my brothers spent 2.5 years in prison. He's 22, 23, I think now. And he's now back in jail. He's been in jail since December, and he's looking at probably like 30 years or something because of what he got arrested for. And it was just like, you really get like how completely unfair this whole system is that's set up. And it's like for us to talk, I have to pay. So I put $20, which is really $25 or $26, because then there's fees, and then it's 30 cents a minute, and it's like until you start delving into like the prison realm of stuff, it's insane, and you're like, like this really is screwed up, and
Yep.
like now I'm getting like why there's so many people in prison, because like you're stuck. I'm like, your actual only time to really prove that you're innocent is like right there when you're being arrested. Like to really get through to somebody, because whatever those cops charge you with, whatever you get put in, you're sitting there and you're waiting. I mean, he's waiting.
Well, they believe everybody's guilty that's in jail.
And I said, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, and he's just sitting in there in prison and since last December. And I'm like, because he can't get bond, he can't get bail, he can't get, and I'm like, yeah, it's just kind of like, wow, until and it's like, wow.
Well, and there's ways too that debt piles up on you when you're in jail.
Absolutely.
I mean, you actually can go into debt while being in jail.
Yes.
Because they charge you for so much of the stuff you need to live.
I put money into his account one time, and he said, "Don't do that. I owed them too much." And I went, "Well, I mean, at some point, don't you have to pay that?"
Yeah, no, you come out of jail in debt. It's crazy.
And so I was just like, wow, that really does stink.
Yeah. Rachel's got her hand up.
I don't know how to put it down, so you can ignore it after
I got
I'm done. So just one of the things that's been on my mind is educating myself for the purpose of being able to be better at having conversations. Because I've heard from a lot of sources exactly what you said tonight, Paul, which is that people of color and Black people particularly are so tired of having to bear the burden of educating white people. And to me, that's been, I don't know that I'm quite ready. I sort of think of this as, I used to be a dancer, and so you can take dancing classes for a really long time, but that doesn't mean that you're like actually ready for social dancing, where you just show up and like wait for someone to ask you to dance and then somehow magically do a good job of it. Like you're gonna step on a lot of toes and do a lot of dumb things and like elbow people in the face and whatever, and that's part of learning. But you can also take classes and educate yourself and like maybe have a private teacher or whatever to get good enough to start social dancing. And so that's part of what we're doing here. And the very first thing that we can do without having to have any money or like something that I find to be a big barrier is that I happen to live in like a pretty segregated city in a really white part of the city. And I just have no idea how to even meet Black people. It sounds like a dumb thing, but it's just like, I have some Black colleagues, but I also know that like, we're only bridging part of the gap, because like they exist in the same socioeconomic status that I do. I don't know how to get over the race gap and the socioeconomic gap. But the one thing that I can do right where I am is just like start talking to other white people about race and getting good at that and being able to guide people gently but firmly and effectively through those conversations to help them learn. And part of that is I had heard about this thing called Racists Anonymous that this pastor in North Carolina started. that I've been like toying with starting. I haven't figured out how to do that, but because I even hear a little bit of this here too, because like all us white people are like so eager to talk about what we're feeling and what we're learning, and when you're actually in this space with people of color in like an action space, you're not supposed to do that. Like that's the space where we need to listen, and that's totally important, and that's how it should be in those spaces. But then like it seems to me that there's also like there needs to be spaces where white people talk about this with
Yes,
each other,
there
so that
needs
we're
to be.
not we aren't actually offending and re-traumatizing people with what we say by accident, and where we can be confused and have questions and say like, okay, this racially charged interaction happened and I don't really understand what happened, and I need to talk through that with somebody without forcing a person of color to like do that again with us. So anyway, that here I am just like being a white person talking a lot, but that's the thing that's been on my mind.
Thank you. No, I think those are great points. I was going to say a book, and I know people here are in different places with their faith, but there's a book that's written by a pastor, a Protestant pastor in Chicago. And one of the points he makes is he talks about his journey as having 7 stages, 7 phases. He says that, he thinks, in his theory, that all white people have to go through these 7 phases. The interesting thing is, he said, this is not a linear progression. You may go through a phase more than once. You repeat it again. So his 7 phases, not in any particular order. The first one is encounter, sort of a realization, right, of all of this that we're talking about, the systemic nature of racism, your and everything that comes with that. And then the other stages are denial, disorientation, shame, a period of self-righteousness, like I'm really not a bad person, right? I really am a good person. And then there's sort of an awakening, like, wow, I need to do something. And then there's active participation. And I don't know, I think that's a helpful list, because he's not saying people go through that in any particular order. People go through that in various orders because everybody's life and, lived experiences vary. Rachel, I would say, don't worry so much about trying to cross also the socioeconomic boundaries, but, in terms of really, if you can really befriend those African Americans that are on the job that, are in, then do that. I mean, if there's real opportunity there to make friends. But 7, again, just in case anybody was writing them down: encounter, denial, disorientation, shame, self-righteousness, awakening, and active participation. The book is called White Awake, but he walks through that with his own life, little autobiographical.
The author's name?
Daniel Hill.
Who's the author?
Daniel Hill, H-I-L-L, just Daniel Hill.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, I was thinking, Rachel, I was thinking, I've actually always lived in Hispanic and African American communities, and I volunteered years ago in Tampa, and I volunteered with teen moms, and so most of the teen moms that I mentored were Hispanic and African American. In fact, when I was pregnant with my daughter, who's now 13, I swore I was going to birth a black baby because I had not seen any white babies in like 3 years. I just had this vision in my head. So I've done a lot of diversity stuff before Atlantic Institute. And actually I have a mentor that has mentored me for about 20 years, that is an African American woman from New York. And I do a lot of different programs with her, and she's been a wonderful mentor for me. But so I would almost want to say to you to go volunteer somewhere on like the other side of the tracks, and like get to know some people. I think sometimes that's a great way to do that, to get to know your community and get to know the people around you. I think also when I had kids, a lot changed for me. My daughter had her first baby doll was a little black baby doll, because I saw that study that was done in the 70s or 80s where and I didn't want her to get any opinions of color growing up. I wanted her to form her own opinion. There was a study done in the 70s or 80s where they gave the little girls a little white baby doll and a little black baby doll, and which one was bad and which one was good, you know, and it was, everybody went to the black one as being bad and the white one as being good. And I was just like, I just don't like that. I don't like that kind of stuff. And so that's to this day has always been her favorite baby doll.
That's neat.
It's always been her favorite baby doll. And I can go out in public with it when she was growing up, and I would get looks from white people and black people. And I have family that is racist, and they go, oh, what does she have? Why does she have a black baby doll? I go, why can't she have a black baby doll? Like, you give me a reason why, because who's to say what color child she's going to end up having when she gets older? You know, so why should I set her up in one pattern, one way of thinking? And then only a couple of years ago that I really realized I didn't have any Hispanic dolls. And we are Hispanic. I'm Cuban, you know, and I was like, I you know, so I went and I had like Hispanic Barbie and then a Ken, and then I needed a black Ken and a white Ken and a Hispanic Ken, and I was like, oh crap, no, I have to give, you know, dolls of every background.
Oh my goodness.
But my children are different, a little different, because they have been in mosques and they have been in temples and they have been in synagogues and they've been in the Gurdwaras and they've been all over the place. So they have a well-diverse background of knowledge because of what I do. But I think, you know, making it, you know, the next baby shower you go to, buy a little doll of a different color for the child. Why not? Who says you have to buy one that looks like you? Buy one that's different.
Christina, that's a great point about finding places in our community to volunteer and get to know our community. I know Beth Templeton through United Ministries, and she does this on her own now, but a poverty simulation in terms of kind of walking us through like how we understand poverty and in the Greenville community and things like that. It can be such an eye-opening experience. And Lauren, going back to your point about the intersections and recognizing kind of where those intersections are, it can be really helpful for us to get to know. I mean, just like getting to know our neighbors is a huge small step, but for us introverts, maybe a bigger step than others. But those kinds of things can make a big difference. Janet.
I'm thinking that we haven't brought up another, I think, even more silent minority, and that's the green card holders. So we have these immigrants that are legal, and we have immigrants that are illegal, and we have DACA, but in particular, the green card holders. And there's a Trump-caused issue that he's intentionally set up to delay the printing of green cards. And that's going to set up a whole lot of people to have their green card out of date. And then if they're asked to present it, then they get fined in the least, but perhaps go to jail and then have to go through a whole legal system because they cannot get an updated current green card. So that's just one example of a whole silent group of people that don't have a place to speak up because they're not quite citizens and they're often not white.
Right. I think
Well,
go ahead, Paul.
Well, I was going to say, the moral of the story there is that to me, one of the takeaways from that we have to realize that things that are discriminatory, prejudicial, biased, or racist, we don't have to say that we are that when we're doing it, right? I actually have not heard that tidbit of information, but it doesn't surprise me in the least. I mean, government officials, whether they be in the executive branch, legislative branch, bureaucrats, whatever, judges, there's always ways to stonewall something while claiming with a straight face without batting your eyes that you're not doing that, I'm doing this, but yet you're doing it for that. And that's the subtlety of systemic racism that we have to become aware of. It goes back to one of the problems with racism, that one of the challenges many people face with understanding systemic racism is that something is not racist based on the intentions of the person who does it even. This is a slightly different point. But if the effect is disproportionately disadvantaging one group or disproportionately favoring another group, then it's racist. And so, you know, even though somebody says I'm not doing it for that reason, if you want to take them at their word, but the effect of their action is racist. So I don't care what your words are. And that is one of the critical factors of understanding systemic racism. It's about the collective effects of behaviors. It's not about people's intentions or stated intentions. And many people miss that little nuance.
Yeah, Catherine's got her hand up, but just kind of a further thing, going back to our conversation about privilege and what Paul said about how understanding and checking our privilege is negative in the sense of kind of acknowledging the ways in which it harms other people, but it's also a positive in terms of recognizing where our privilege gives us a voice for those who don't have a voice, and how do we use our voice from a position of privilege in order to speak up for those who can't. And I think that's a good kind of example of another group, another avenue, another place where privilege can be used in a positive way. Catherine.
Hello. So I think this is like touching on like a lot of what has been said. But just because, so a little bit ago, Paul, you had asked like if anybody, like if as a white person, like we have like someone of color who, can like serve as a mentor. And we've talked about like, how do we kind of open our relationships across kind of racial lines. And I know not everybody on here is from Greenville, but in Greenville, I think that is especially difficult, the way that I think partly just the way that like neighborhoods work. Like if I'm going to like become friends with my neighbors, like they're all white. My church was planted about almost 4 years ago with the intent of being, among other things, like we knew like we were going to be anti-racist, and my pastor preaches against racism regularly, but right now, like you're still mostly white congregation at Greenville Tech, which I love. Very complicated with COVID right now, but I love it. But my department, we have 20 full-time English instructors, 19 of them are white. So, so then and I've talked with other white people who can run the risk of like somehow like the end goal is like and I think Ijoma addressed this, but like at the beginning of like the end goal is like having more friends across racial lines, as if that kind of like proves something or like vindicates ourselves. I don't think it's helpful, but I do think it is for our good that our relationships are like crossing racial lines and crossing economic lines, and we do need that desperately. But when I ask people, talk like, what does that look like for you in Greenville, where we're so segregated in so many ways? A lot of times people jump to like volunteer, and I think that can be good, but I also think I would like to know y'all's thoughts on this, but like I think there can be a risk of being like, oh, like the place where I, as a white person, can meet people of color is somewhere where I am interacting with people who have fewer advantages than I do, and I can help them, and it can reinforce a white savior narrative in a way that I think is very unhelpful.
Yes.
But
ding on that white savior narrative. Yes.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
But then, but it's just like, I'm not going to like be able to get into a deep conversation with someone I'm like shopping with at Ingles, and so like my move is to a place where I won't have a washer dryer. So I'm planning to just go to the laundromat And, you know, like we can have conversations there more than we can if I'm like buying bread, and it's not like you know, we're there because we just need to wash our clothes. But I just would love to know like other thoughts on like, what do you do? Or is it just like as a white person, I use my privilege to open up like hiring practices, you know, like investigate like why are more people of color not in these
Yes,
spaces?
do that. Push it, agitate all the time. That's what I'm doing at North Greenville.
We've already got a rep at Tech,
so yeah, but you got to keep pushing. It takes a while. I mean, you know, institutions move slowly, but yeah.
So what you're saying, Catherine, is that the next time that I can plan an event in person, I'm going to have to plan meet your neighbor event at the library or something where we can all come together and meet people and make friends of different, and somebody that's different than you, and now you work on your friendships together, because I know what you're talking about. I mean, it's sometimes you go, I don't see anybody else.
Well, not to put in a little plug to the Atlantic Institute, but like that's exactly, I mean, like to a certain extent, it's been an awesome avenue, I know, for me, to get to know different like people within my community, within the Greenville community that I never would have interacted with, particularly because I do work in a church, and so I kind of, you know, end up in like my one little, you know, location. It is harder for me to kind of want to step into a room full of people that I don't necessarily know anybody. That's, you know, that the introvert on me is kind of like, oh my gosh. But getting involved with organizations like this, because you're right, Catherine, like if we look at it only from a volunteer perspective, it raises that kind of situation of power structure that we need to be aware of and kind of work on. But where are those community groups? Keith's got his hand up, so I'm gonna let him speak. But I am very grateful for organizations like this that put me in positions of being able to talk with, like Paul and I never would have met if it hadn't been for the Atlantic Institute. So, you know, right off the bat, there's where are those avenues for making friendships? So, Keith.
Johanna, thanks so much. Let me just, I know that we are towards the end of the program. I was not able to sit down and listen quite like now. I was driving, but I have been truly enjoyed and moved with every comment and everything here. I was kind of thinking myself for sure that I was not a racist person. I never thought the racism was in my life at all. But now when I truly quietly listen everything over here, I see unconsciously there's racism within me. So unconsciously there is some elements of racism in my thought process, in my, you know, somehow brain somewhere. So I feel there is an intentional struggle and work requires for each and every one, even like person like myself, that thinks, you know, you can never be racist. But somehow the systematic racism is imposing the racism into our mind, into our thought process, in everything. And it seems then for each and every one, it takes, you know, a lot of efforts to kind of, it's like the virus enter into the computer that you are not aware of it, okay? So you don't know there is a virus, but you think that you have a clean and nice computer, it's there. Somehow it's slowing down your system, you do not know it. So I see that there's a virus enter to my life, I was not aware. So those type of conversations is like the antivirus, you know, it's cleaning up my computer. It's kind of really detecting where is the virus, you know, okay, we have detected, now I can remove it. And I can actually create the protection system into my mind so that I will not really have those type of, you know, mind or thought process. So therefore I want to really thank you all, you know, Paul, Johanna, you know, you did a wonderful job and wonderful conversation, and everyone else. I'm so truly enjoyed with everything over here. Just want to kind of leave this as a comment over here.
Thank you. Well, can I just end on I don't know, it's about time for us to end, Christina, probably, or past time, actually. I want to just give a plug on the 16th of, is it 16th of August? I will be leading a discussion of this book called Divided by Faith. And so it is a continuation of this discussion insofar as it's about race. It's not a continuation of this discussion insofar as this book focuses particularly on how evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals, interact with race and think about race. The book was written in the late 90s, but it's amazingly relevant today, especially for those of us in the Greenville area. And many things, so it's really sort of a study of evangelical culture. And so I know a lot of people who do not self-identify as an evangelical Christian theologically find some of their views just like, I just don't get them. Like, I don't understand them. Like, I can't talk to them. Like, they won't listen to me or whatever. There is some of that, I know. So if you have any friends that feel that way, or if you feel that way, if you are interested to try to get into the mind of how evangelicals, the mind of many white evangelicals, of course, not all, there's always exceptions, but you have to make a narrative, do some research, make a point. But the very dominant way of thinking, this book is going to be very helpful. And I'd love to have you join us in this discussion on I believe it's the second Thursday of
August 13th.
13th, thank you. I knew it couldn't be the 16th. Thank you, 13th of August. So we'll be discussing that book, and it's not long, but it is written by two sociologists who are professors, but I think it's fairly readable for a book written by professors. So I would encourage you to read it and discuss it with me on the 13th.
Yes, thank you. I think, did you guys have anything else to add there towards the end here? Or I think we're good. I think we've covered
I'm good.
everything. I know we had like the what's next kind of thing. Okay. So we just want to thank you all for joining in tonight. Thank you very much, Johanna and Paul. We appreciate you guys co-facilitating this conversation. And we enjoy everybody that's been able to get on and help have a deeper, more meaningful conversation. And we encourage you to get out in the community and do something, get something going, get something moving. All right. So if you guys want to go ahead and unmute, that way you can say goodbye and thank you to the speakers, you can.
Hey there, Paul. Thank you for being our one black man, but I intentionally didn't invite my black friends because this was really a book talking to us. And I knew you would be able to be a leader and a good representative and straighten us out or direct us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this. It's a difficult topic for a whole lot of reasons, for a whole lot. Everybody, it's a difficult topic, for a different reason for every person. But I appreciate you all being in here tonight.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Joanna. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr.
Appreciate it.
Patrick, thanks for joining.
Thank you for hosting.
Hi, Janet. Thanks for coming all the way from Colorado.
Bye, Keith.
And all the way.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Sorry. I texted Paul. I'm sorry I couldn't participate tonight because my internet connection was so bad.
That's okay. Thank you. We're glad that you were here and you could
Thanks
hear
for
it.
being here.
Yes,
All right.
thanks for joining. Bye-bye.
We'll see you.